Here we are for another quick chat on the technical side of server meshing. So this weekend there was a test going on and it was really interesting and really fun, and I wanted to take a few minutes here to talk about some assumptions I'm making, and I want to be very clear. This is me making guesses. So I am not trying to tell anyone that these are factual things. So if you disagree or if you have a different take, I would love to have the conversation in the comments. Little news items before we get rolling here. Space Tomato put out a podcast today. I'll link it in the description below, with Kevin Riggle and myself about server meshing. I would love if you would go take a gander at that and see what Kevin had to say. With that said, I thought I'd talk about this weekend. So I did notice on some of the forums there were obviously some issues. There was Salty Mike React, where he went through a lot of the videos on the issues that were seen. And the ones that stuck out in my mind, there was an interesting one where the elevators were not really spawned properly, and then someone used a tractor beam on an elevator and that caused it to pop in. And that actually makes perfect sense to me. If something was not cleanly brought in from the replication layer, either to the server or the client, I'm not sure which, and it was in this kind of amorphous state, then by hitting it with an object that is going to act on it in a physical way, you can sometimes kind of clean out those somewhat wonky variables and reset them so that it's back in place, right? The tractor beam pulls on it, that causes the physics engine to go, is this pull enough to move it? The answer is no, so it says, okay, well then it's where it was. And that's kind of a backdoor-ish way to act on the item and cause it to firm up its state in the server. The second one is there were a bunch of systems, and I noticed this as well, when a server would come back, there seemed to be a variable lag before some of the systems would kick in, whether that's Armistice or the comm array or whatnot. And I think it's interesting. I'm sure that that's not high on their list, but there is an interesting question there about the syncing of these external states, right? Because the server has to come up, it has to get populated with the information for where all the entities are. Then it has to figure out which of those entities might be impacted by these different kind of blanket states, these blanket states, and then apply those. Now, what I don't know is where those states originate from. They're an attribute of an object, right? An object is in an armistice zone, and an armistice zone has to be defined by something, probably a set of coordinates. Same thing with the comm array, right? So in order to know if an object is in that area, math has to happen. And when a server comes up, that tells me that those states are not maintained. So if I'm a player in New Babbage and a server crash happens, then when the new server comes up, it does not know that it has not been told that I have this state of armistice zone and comm array. I'm not sure if that's a huge deal, but it is somewhat interesting in looking at the inner workings of this. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I really think what we see in these is the most stripped down and base function of server meshing. The very first step I would take is to have the single server instance with all the players covering the entire Stanton system, just like we have today, with the new replication layer, and I would assume the new path to talk to the clients, us as the players. And then when it crashes, I would want the system to start from nothing. So there's no backup server, there's no infrastructure in place to quickly respond, right? You want to see what happens. That main service crashes, disappears, they killed it, whatever. And then what you're looking at is the worst case scenario, right? Of, okay, there's a running cluster, for lack of a better word, and the last server has failed. What is going to happen next? Right? It's going to start up a new, or a set of new servers, quote unquote, populate those out of the replication layer, assign their duties, and then it has to coordinate the tasking for the server to the clients and make sure that those guys are all in sync. By doing it this way, it really feels like one of those kind of minimum viable product, right? If let's take all of the fancy out of this just for the base layer functionality of the replication layer split, allowing the server to fail without blowing up, the whole shard, as it were. I don't think, and I especially don't think, because it's only the second or third time we've seen this, this is not the final state. This is kind of the very initial testing, the supporting infrastructure underneath it that will take this base functionality, this minimum set they need to accomplish, and make it better. The very easiest thing they could do is have multiple servers up in a kind of standby state. They can have them up and running, and especially in a static server mesh, I would expect the idea is to have that flexible handoff between them. So if a server disappears, a service disappears, you're not having to reinstantiate everything in the shard on one server that you started up from a cold start. And that's generally how people in the industry test things. They start with the least number of moving parts, make sure that works, because it's easier to solve things like these elevators and these external systems like the comm arrays when you have this very linear path and when the handoff is being done so cleanly. Once you get into a situation where you have 5 servers running Stanton and you want to kill one of them, there's just so much more information floating around. You have players who are fully functional and fine, over on Hurston, but on Microtech, they're frozen. Every step you take towards that more complex deployment becomes more difficult to debug. That's my take on where we are. Like I said, most of what I've said in this video is complete conjecture. I would be very interested in people's thoughts on this. And please, if you have the time, go take a look at Space's podcast. Again, it's linked below. I thought it was a lot of fun. I hope you guys find some value in it. And with that, I will talk to you soon.